لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I hope everyone's doing well. It's an honor to be invited to speak, and thank you for all of you for attending, for taking the time to attend. Sister Raviba had asked me to ask everyone to, well, I was going to disable the chat, but I'm thinking, just because I'm coming from a distance, we may have technical issues. So maybe what I'll do is, maybe I'll leave the chat open in case you can't at one point hear me, or if my volume gets too low. But if I could just kindly request that during the presentation, if you can avoid discussion or questions, and save the questions till the end. But if there's technical issues, just let me know. I should also mention that I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so I may pause the mic for a few seconds if I need to cough, and in that case, that means I'm still around. I just if you don't hear me for 5 or 10 seconds, that means I'm still here. I'm just coughing, so please bear with me. All right, Bismillah. So this webinar session, inshallah, for the next, I'll try to present some ideas for about 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. I don't want to keep you for too long, but I do want to create some, or allow for some time for discussion and for questions. I think that's often the most effective part of the sessions, is when we can engage in conversation. So I'd like to just present some ideas to add some food for thought, and then open it up for discussions in relation to things that you find important to you as homeschooling parents or as teachers, and we can discuss some of the issues that you may be having in terms of teaching. So this webinar is entitled Understanding and Applying Islamic Pedagogy, and I'll speak a little bit about what I mean by Islamic pedagogy, but I'd like to just say a few things to set the foundation. And some of these points are simple truths, I think, for us, but I think important for us to reiterate as educators, because whether we're parents or teachers, we're all educators. And I think we need to acknowledge consciously, as we educate, that the way that we teach has an impact. And what I mean by that is the way that we teach, i.e. everything that we do as parents and as teachers, the way we dress, the way we talk, the way we walk, the way we reprimand children, the way we smile at them, everything has an impact. Everything is a lesson. And the reason why this point is very important is because it contradicts, or not, it doesn't really contradict, but it shows a distinction between the common conception that education is about what's in the curriculum or what's in the textbook. And what I want to make clear is that education is not solely what's in a curriculum, but it's what comes from who we are as individuals. So children are always learning by our behavior. And by virtue, if they're learning by our behavior, that means that every movement that we make as educators has an impact, something we should be conscious of. The second point, the way that we teach is a form of education in and of itself. So thinking of tarbiyah, for instance, we often think about Islamic education as being grounded in this concept of tarbiyah, of nurturing wholeness, of nurturing a sense of love and mercy and the values that are within the Islamic tradition. So the way that we teach is in and of itself a form of education. So we are teaching by virtue of who we are. The third is that we teach the way we are taught. And this is the unfortunate reality, and sometimes fortunate reality. But if we were taught a certain way, we often subconsciously teach the same way when we go into a classroom or, parenting our children. So if we were taught that, there's a term called tough love. It's like when parents will say things to their children in a negative way, hoping that's going to motivate them. So they'll say, you'll never be able to achieve that, and they'll say, well, we said that with the hope that that would motivate the child. I mean, it's this approach of, well, I was brought up a certain way, and therefore I'm going to treat the children a certain way, the children that I have a certain way. And it's very subconscious, right? Even if you think about your teachers, think about your own schooling experiences. All of us went to school of some shape or form, whether it be a homeschool, informal education, formal education. We've all gone to school. Thinking about our own schooling experience, the way that we can recall very clearly which teachers made an impact on us. Either a negative impact, where we know that we would never want to be like that teacher, or we have a positive impact, where we say we would like to model our teaching based on a particular teacher we had in our past. So we often teach the way we were taught. We teach because we have particular beliefs about education. So all of us as educators, the reason why you've all attended this session and the reason why you're so committed to education is because we have particular beliefs about education. We feel strongly about making a difference. And we have a particular conception of how to make that difference in our minds. We know that we want to educate children. Some of us will be sitting here and saying, my approach to teaching is to take children outside and let them see the beauties that Allah has, the beauty of what Allah's creation is. Take them out to, take them hiking and take them biking and let them be outside of the classroom. Somebody else's approach would say, we want to teach our children to become huffaz and memorize the Quran and see the wisdoms of the Quran. Everyone has a different particular belief of what should be emphasized in education. So we have those inherent beliefs in ourselves. And the fifth point that I think will set the foundation for the rest of this talk is that we can draw out principles of teaching if we reflect on our own teaching. So there are principles. If we think about how we're teaching, we would be able to analyze what the principle is that's driving what we do and how we do it. And that's what's very interesting, is because there's always principles at play. There's always principles that are subconsciously being used. The local IB school in Ajman, or the local British school in Sharjah, each school has a set of principles, and if they're not articulated standards or principles of teaching, that means that they're probably they're so embedded in the system that everyone recognizes that this is how you teach in a British school, or this is how you teach in an IB school. This is just the standard of teaching in an IB school. This is our instructional approach. The question then becomes, what is our instructional approach? What is it that makes Islamic education, in terms of our instructional approach, Islamic? How do we teach in a way that makes our teaching Islamic, and not just in terms of the curriculum? So I think why we're having this session is to do a few things. The first is because I want to make the distinction between what we teach and how we teach. What we teach is the curriculum, and how we teach is the actual instructional practice. I think there's benefit in both, but I think what often happens is we overemphasize one over the other. So for the past 30, 40 years of Islamic education, in particular, there's been an overemphasis on curriculum development. Everyone wants a textbook. Everyone wants the best textbook, the most colorful textbook, the one with the nicest pictures. But we often assume that if I have the nicest textbook, I'm going to know what to do with it. And I think that in itself is we're putting ourselves in a difficult position, because we're assuming that material in our hands is going to help us achieve this true sense of tarbiyah. And that's why we're opening up this conversation to then talk about what does it mean in terms of our instructional practice. The second is because the hope that some of the questions that I will raise, and in the time that we have, I likely won't get very far, but the intent is some of the questions that hopefully I leave you with will help improve our instructional practice. And it'll make our teaching, not just our curriculum, more Islamic. And I put Islamic under quotes because I think there are, and I'll speak about why that is, but there's particular principles that you'll draw on, that you will emphasize. Naturally, we as when we look at the prophetic tradition of the Prophet ﷺ, we will inevitably emphasize even though we'll try to emphasize everything balanced. We can't be perfect, but we'll try to emphasize both mercy and justice at the same time. We'll try to emphasize all of those characteristics at the same time, but inevitably, sometimes some get emphasized over others. So what I'm going to speak about is, I'm going to talk about what the term pedagogy means. I'm then going to talk about whether we have a pedagogy, and look at some of the principles of Islamic pedagogy before we close. The term pedagogy, for those of us that may not be familiar with the term, is simply the method or practice of teaching. The method or practice of teaching. So in other words, it's instruction. But the reason why I'm using the word pedagogy, someone could say, well, Nadeem, why don't you just use the word instruction then? Or why don't you just use the word teaching? Because the word pedagogy forces us to think deeply that when there is a pedagogy, it's like a philosophy. It's rooted in a philosophy of education. A pedagogy is rooted in a philosophy of education, and which gives us the inroad to look at the Islamic tradition and say, how does the Quran and the Sunnah direct us to think about education from within the Islamic tradition? So that's now we know that there are numerous ayat of the Quran that state that the Messenger of Allah, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, has been sent to us, to mankind, as a messenger to teach us. And the emphasis on the Prophet ﷺ being sent to us, to mankind, as a teacher is something that I don't think with this group we need to overly emphasize, but it is important to recognize that we are learning from the words, the actions, the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ in every respect, and that's where we draw our pedagogy from, because he is the lived experience of the Quran. Now, if we say to ourselves that we take from these ayats and we say to ourselves that the Prophet ﷺ is our archetypal teacher, when he said, which is quoted in Sahih Muslim, that he was sent as a teacher. And we know that in the prophetic tradition or from the Quran we learn that the Prophet ﷺ also has been given extraordinary intelligence, unlike intelligence of any human being. And that intelligence tells us that then his decisions in every moment of his life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is a moment worthy of reflection. And worthy of reflection to the extent that we can draw principles from. We can do two things from the prophetic tradition. We can emulate them, and we can draw principles from them. Emulating them would mean trying to do what he did in each instance, which is part of it. But the other half of it is trying to draw principles so that we can adapt and look at if the Prophet ﷺ showed mercy to particular people in their learning. What was the context in which they were learning, and how did he show mercy at that particular moment? How can we then apply that into our own context, whether it be in our homes or it be in our classrooms? How do we apply it? People often ask me, they say, so does an Islamic pedagogy mean that we must all sit on the floor? And I say, well, that's one way of interpreting it. But the other way of interpreting it is to say that there was a simplicity in learning, or there was a closeness in learning. That we know that when the Prophet ﷺ would teach, he would teach with a certain sense of physical closeness to the Sahaba. That we can gain from and say there needs to be, how do we nurture a sense of closeness amongst our students? That doesn't mean they can't sit in desks necessarily. It means that we need to ask ourselves, how do we nurture a sense of community and closeness amongst our students? Okay. Third, we know that the Prophet ﷺ was inspired by Allah in terms of his deeds and his speeches, in terms of his deeds and his spoken word, which means then that we can also take from that. And I'm reiterating things that I know that all of you know, so I'll skip through this a little bit faster, but I just want to emphasize where Islamic pedagogy comes from, and to say that it comes as a system not as a individual necessarily moment in the seerah, but we take from the seerah and the Quran as a whole, from the Quran and the Sunnah as a whole, and we draw from there. So what makes a pedagogy Islamic? If now I mentioned earlier, I said, you could have a British school or an IB school or an American school or any type of school out there, and they would have principles. Where do their principles come from? I mean, most of their principles, most of Western Western theories of education come from writers on education. People who have thought about educational philosophy, they've written about educational theory, they've tried it, they've drawn from their experiences, but in the end it's theory. It's another way of doing things. Now, I'm not saying that somehow Islamic education would be counter to Western education. I'm saying that Islamic education needs to define itself, and once we define ourselves, there may be major similarities that are complementary to other forms of education. But we can't simply borrow from others until we've defined ourselves. And that's where the important aspect comes in, is the necessity of us to define our own pedagogy, our own philosophy of education. So a pedagogy is Islamic when the method and practice of teaching does not contradict the aims, objectives, and ethics of revelation. So it must be in line with the Quranic edicts. It must closely reflect an Islamic ethos and worldview. It must reflect and approach the prophetic teachings. And it must prove effective in developing a student in every aspect. And what that means is that Islamic pedagogy must be holistic. It cannot just be thinking about academic excellence and student achievement. It must also be thinking about moral education, character education, whatever term you would like to use, but it has to think about the moral self, the ethical self, the spiritual self. It has to frame itself beyond the conventional conception of education. So, excuse me, principles of pedagogy. It's important also, I think, for us to define principle before I move forward. A principle, not like a school principal, that would be a different way, but a principle is a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior or for a chain of reasoning. It's a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as a foundation. So imagine we had a list of fundamental truths or propositions for our organizations, for our schools, that said these are the instructional standards, these are the instructional principles upon which our school is built. And so these propositions serve as that foundation for our instructional practice. What does this all mean for us? I think for us, this means something I began with, which is a simple concept, but one that I think we've overlooked for a long time. And that is that Islamic education, when we use the term Islamic education, it is not just the curriculum content, but it is also the instructional practice. And when we start to think about, I often have parents and teachers come to me and say, Brother Nadeem, one of the biggest challenges we have in our school is our students are not motivated to learn Islamic education. They are bored in class. They're not enjoying class. And I ask them how they're teaching, and they say, well, we use this textbook. And I say, well, that's good. What else do you do? And they say, well, that's the focus of our teaching. And I say, well, so that I think when teachers begin to recognize that students need to be engaged, students need to be engaged mentally, intellectually, they need to be engaged spiritually, they need to feel a connection. I often share this example. I'm from Canada, from Toronto. I mean, originally from Pakistan, but I've been living in Canada. And years ago, I taught this course called Civics. It was a grade 10 civics course in a high school. And I was told the next chapter that I had to teach was about using the ATM, the automated teller machine, the bank machine, pretty much. So I had to teach this unit, and I laughed and I said, this is ridiculous. How can I teach students to use an ATM through a textbook? And that was that moment for me in my life when I said, years ago, when I said to myself that there's a problem with the usage of textbooks, because there's certain things that just should not be in a textbook. There's certain things that should just be lived experience. And I often see this even in Islamic studies textbooks when I see, chapters on prayer, and I think to myself, we pray 5 times a day. I don't know if we need a chapter on prayer. Can we just show children and speak to children about it and show them I mean, people who are visual learners, they see it, they act it through. Their children will learn through practice. But to have a chapter on prayer just makes me feel as though, you can't learn something that is such a lived spiritual experience through through a textbook. And this is, I think, this is where the prophetic tradition comes in. Our Prophet ﷺ taught us through action, often through action, especially things that required a spiritual connection. I would imagine it. There's certain things obviously that you might need through writing. Recitation of the Quran could be maybe enhanced through writing and through oral communication. But things like prayer, I mean, it may benefit some. If you're thinking about multiple intelligences, yes, it may benefit some, but it shouldn't be reliant. And I definitely didn't want to be reliant on teaching how to use an ATM machine through a textbook. Okay, so I think the benefits of about thinking of such an approach is that we want to make tarbiyah, this idea of nurturing wholeness in children, we want to make it real. We want to make it lived. We want to make it relevant. We want to make Islamic education relevant. And I think that's one of the things why I feel so honored to be speaking with educators like yourself, because I don't think I have any answers, but I definitely appreciate speaking with educators who are passionate about wanting to do just this. And I know this is the benefit you're looking for, because I know that from my experience of speaking with educators like yourselves, it's one of the biggest challenges we have is making Islamic education connect at a very deep level with our children. And I think that's where our teaching approach really, really needs to be thought through. We want students to learn life lessons just through our teaching. I mean, how many times have we heard people who say that I've sat with my elders, or my children were brought up with their grandparents, and it made such an impact on my children? How many of us look for our children to be brought up with their grandparents? For that same reason, because we realize the tarbiyah that is so natural in that connection. And yet we forget when we walk into a classroom the importance of connecting with human beings, with hearts, as opposed to just connecting or imposing particular content. So sorry about that. Okay, so the Islamic Teacher Education Program, which is an online teacher training program, which some of you I know are very familiar with, introduces educators to 7 principles of Islamic pedagogy. What I've been doing, I mean, I'm nowhere close to being qualified to do something like this. I'm merely an educator, a trained educator. I don't even say I'm a good educator. I just happen to be trained at it. I've been working with some scholars from across North America who are from different parts of the world, and who have been looking at the Islamic tradition, at the Quran and the Sunnah, to draw these principles of Islamic pedagogy. So in our program, in the Islamic Teacher Education Program, we introduce educators to these 7 principles of Islamic pedagogy in our last course, where we speak about what instruction may look like or should look like. And what I try to do is I try to help teachers understand what those principles may look like in practice. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to have time to introduce you to 7, but I'll introduce you to 1 today, 1 principle, which will help you understand the potential of, or the meaning of, what a principle may look like. So I'm just going to share a few aspects of the Islamic tradition first. The first aspect of, we ask the question, when should learning happen? Like how often, or what time of day, and things like that. And one of the most influential teachers and disciples of the Blessed Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abdullah ibn Masud radiallahu an, was asked of his students to teach every day. And he responded, "The only thing preventing me from speaking to you every day is the fear that I might bore you." For the Prophet ﷺ used to be selective in bestowing his teachings upon us out of fear that we would become bored. And Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, commenting on this tradition, says it is recommended to break the continuity of intensity when it comes to acts of righteousness out of fear that it may lead to boredom. And I'm sharing this because I'm going back to that example I said earlier, that one of our greatest challenges that we experience now today, it seems, as an ummah across the globe, is motivating children, given the social pressures, given the global movement of popular culture, largely American popular culture, is getting students to be motivated, to be committed, and to just really engage with the benefits and the beauties of Islam. So when I read this, I think to myself about the challenges that we have, and sometimes we feel that, we have to cover a course, like it's like a math course, right? If you don't finish the math course by the end of the semester, the students will not be ready for the next grade. But then I ask myself, when we're teaching Islam, is it really about imposing or stuffing down material, or is it looking for some form of transformation? What's more important? Is it more important that students finish learning or memorizing those hadith or those ayats of the Quran before they finish that grade? Or is it more important that they engage deeply with a few? Some may engage with more. But I'm asking questions. I don't have answers necessarily, but I'm asking questions that I think we need to consider. Of, if we know that the prophetic tradition tells us that when it comes to matters of righteousness, especially with children, especially when we know that in the prophetic tradition we're told that the first 7 years are often considered for play, and we ask ourselves, to what extent should we be stuffing material, content among students about Islam, or do we let it be, or what do we teach students at what particular age? The second thing I want to share is is another ayat from the Quran, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and there's multiple ayats of the Quran that mention that Allah has created the earth with signs. There are signs on earth for us to reflect on. And this, if you combine I'm going to go back to the previous slide. If you combine this aspect, that students will generally get bored if they're not engaged. And yet we know that Allah has told us that yet there's such immense signs. If we were to just reflect on the signs of Allah, we would have an appreciation for. This is what we want children to have. We want children to have this sense of connection, this sense of appreciation, this sense of awe. But yet they're here. So how do we balance the two? And this is where a principle comes in. So the seventh principle of the 7 principles of Islamic pedagogy that have been drawn, and I just want to mention that those 7 principles are working principles. It's not like it's set in stone. Those are just those are principles that are derived by a group of scholars that, inshallah, other scholars who are more familiar with the Islamic tradition will, inshallah, build on. But this is a stepping stone. And one of those principles, the last one, draws from the Islamic tradition and says formal instruction is occasional, it nurtures reflection, and it evokes a sense of awe and wonder. I'll say that again. It's formal instruction. So in other words, children come to school between 8:30 and 3:30, or whatever the school's timings might be. Or if they're homeschooled, formal instruction may mean particular hours of the day that are set aside for formal instruction. And the principle says that formal instruction should be occasional. And occasional doesn't mean that they go to school every other day. It could mean that. It can be interpreted in different ways. It could also mean that during a math class or during an Islamic studies class, there's part of it for lecturing and part of it for textbook work, and part of it for an activity. But there's a balance. It's not constant lecturing. It's not constant. Um, it's not a constant barrage of content on students. Secondly, it nurtures reflection. So formal instruction must nurture reflection. Students need to be given the time to think, to reflect, to ask questions, and it must evoke a sense of awe and wonder. How do you achieve awe and wonder? I don't know. Personally, I'm not sure if it can be achieved through a textbook, but that could just be me. But how do you achieve awe and wonder? Maybe it's through the types of questions we ask. Maybe it's through the things that we show children. Maybe it's what we introduce them to. Maybe it's the breadth of knowledge that they constantly are introduced to. But that's the formal instruction needs to be balanced in how we teach. So this raises a few questions for us in terms of applications. Now, we as parents who are homeschooling, or as teachers who are teaching in classrooms, how do we apply this? Let's think about the intensity of our teaching first. How often do we teach students in formal classrooms? How much time are we lecturing? How much time are we giving them seat work? Is the school day really necessary? Now that's, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of homeschoolers that would agree with that. But I mean, that doesn't, there's some of us that think that schools are important, and others that think that formal schooling is not important. That's fine. Those are different perspectives in education. There's no right answer. But there is a consciousness that if you are teaching in a school, you're teaching with a particular perspective. And if you're teaching at home, you're teaching with a particular perspective. But to know what that perspective is what's important. Secondly, do the hours of instruction vary or increase as students mature? So in other words, you know, we often now, because of the way our society works, in many places where the household requires two incomes, you know, the societal changes are really affecting schooling. And my frustration is that if you think about the movement of public education, mass public education, which Islamic schools are shaped around, these things are shaped around an economy. And we have school hours that are meant to reflect the workday. That wasn't how education took place before the 19th century, before the mid 19th century. It wasn't how education took place. So when I think we have full day primary school, or sorry, full day preschool. And again, that's because we want to make sure that mothers can go back to work even earlier in their career. And that's fine for some people, but I'm just talking about structural changes. I'm talking about, do the hours of instruction vary or increase as students mature? So how many hours of instruction does a child really need? At what age? And should they get more hours of instruction? I would think when they get older, when they get 12 and 13 and so on. How intense or complex is our instruction for varying ages? Example, oftentimes I now see we have exams for young children. And we all know the amount of stress that exams give, and the anxieties, and the pressures, and the number of students that feel their failures at a very young age, which has a major impact on their psyche. So I mean, if we're trying to nurture tarbiyah, and we know what our what Islamic pedagogy teaches us, we know what the prophetic tradition teaches us to encourage, then we need to ask ourselves about some of the things that we're doing in our classrooms. Secondly, then how do we think about evoking awe and wonder? What do we do to inspire awe and wonder among students about Islam? What do we do in our classrooms? To understand Allah's signs, we must experience the signs. How often is our teaching in natural environments? And children ask difficult questions. I'm sure you all recognize this. Do we harness that energy or do we turn it away? And I often get parents or teachers who say, well, young children don't ask difficult questions. I think young children ask the most difficult questions. Because young children ask a very simple question. And you all know what this is. The question is why? When a young child asks you why, they don't need to string together a sentence or two sentences or a paragraph to explain their question. They just say why. And that, when they ask why, we have two very quick options. We can say, uh, we can shut down the question, or we can help them understand it. Because if you shut down the question, you may never get that question again. But that curiosity is so natural. And shutting down that curiosity is shutting down that sense of awe and wonder. Because in that moment, when that 3-year-old or 4-year-old asks you a question, why? That's a moment where they're in awe of something. Why are the clouds up there? Why are the clouds moving? That's a sense of awe of Allah's creation. At that very moment, that child is in awe of Allah's creation. And I mean, yes, we should say I don't know. If you don't know, you say you don't know, but I would say we need to find an answer that at least satisfies them, or go look for an answer very quickly. But don't stunt children's awe and wonder. And I think that's the one thing that we need to recognize, that I think we need to recognize that um, you can either teach awe and wonder, or you can just let it be natural. And letting it be natural means allowing for these questions to be um, to be harnessed. Okay. So I'm just gonna close. I've been speaking for a fair amount of time. I'm gonna close now with just a few closing remarks. The first is that I think I'd like you to recognize, which I'm sure you do, but just kind of reiterating, this is more for ourselves as a reminder, that the way that we teach matters. And I've said this a few times in a number of different ways, but I want us to recognize that the way that we teach matters. The second is that principles of teaching can be drawn out. So yes, there are principles of teaching, there are standards, there are ways that exist that we can draw out from the Islamic tradition, from the Quran and the Sunnah. The third is that there are principles of Islamic pedagogy. There are, and we don't currently have them. We haven't. We need to get more scholars involved in drawing out those principles for us as teachers, because those are the wisdoms that are going to drive and raise the level of interaction, the level of instruction, and the effectiveness in the end for ourselves as educators. And this really only is going to improve ourselves in our own teaching for the sake of our children. And lastly, I'm hoping that improving your teaching requires reflecting on why you teach the way you teach. So if anything, if you can leave today by taking some of the concepts that I may have spoken about, looking at even the example principle that I gave, and asking yourself, how do I teach? What is it that, if you had to just articulate your own teaching philosophy or your own teaching perspective, what are your beliefs in teaching? What are your values? And where are those values coming from? Because that will help you identify what can be improved, and what can be what you can continue to do. Okay. Jazakallah khairan. I hope that inshallah this was of some benefit to you. I apologize if my voice was not clear, or if I was if I was misunderstood in any way. But inshallah I'll open it up for questions now and field a few questions. And again, it's been an honor to have the opportunity. Sure. Yes, I'm here. I was just giving my voice a break for a minute. Um, wa iyyakum to all of you who have commented. Um, to the question about sharing the other seven or the other six principles of the seven principles, uh, for me to have done that in this session would have made the session quite lengthy. As you saw, to even go through the one principle, it takes a fair amount of time to unpack the principle. I think, inshallah, maybe for a future session, we can schedule it where either we can coordinate where I go through the other principles in some way, shape, or form. But I unfortunately don't have them memorized, so I can't just articulate them off the top of my head. If you don't mind. Okay, so the first question is, can you tell us about the course? Right, so the course is run, the Islamic Teacher Education Program. You can go to the website Islamic Teacher Education, all one word, .com. I'll type it here. The program is run, it's a full year program designed for full-time educators. So if you are currently in a teaching position, it's designed for you in the sense that it's not meant to be um, uh, meant to be overwhelming in your workday. I would assume that if you can have about 3 to 5 hours a week to dedicate to an online course, that would be good. The program, it consists of 3 courses that are designed like university semestered courses. Um, the first one talks about philosophy, the vision of Islamic education. The second one addresses issues of curriculum and curriculum integration. And the third course talks about these principles or practicing Islamic pedagogy in classrooms. There's a few of you who are online right now that have taken the program. If you'd like to comment about anything, feel free to comment. I think the program has major benefits in terms of pushing our thinking, um, both in terms of our vision of education and how that vision is put into practice, as well as the curriculum course is quite heavy, I think, in terms of looking at curriculum models, curriculum approaches, and then this idea of integration across subject areas, interdisciplinary. Um, um, yeah, so that's, like I mentioned, there's more information that can be found online. The course does begin every semester. So there's a new cohort that just started in January. There'll be another new cohort that starts in April, inshallah, or May, sorry, in May. And there's another cohort that will begin in September. So it starts 3 times a year, and you can enroll at any time, inshallah, and you can take it for the year um, sequentially. Okay, I see a lot of questions, so I'm just gonna scroll back up and see if I can capture them before I miss them. Uh-oh. Okay, I'm just trying to read the other questions. 1 second. How would I recommend dealing with issues related to scholarly difference of opinion in fiqh topics? This often creates unwanted stress and confusion between students. That's a very good question. I think that is an issue that needs to be addressed by the school um, and the administration and the school philosophy or the school vision and approach before it arises in a classroom. And the reason I say this is because you're very right that when it comes to fiqh topics, but even when it comes to regular everyday practice of what is considered Islamic or not Islamic, um, by different groups within our ummah, it becomes an issue. So I think it's important for administrators to come together with teachers, Islamic studies teachers, and talk about how are we going to address these issues of difference of opinion. Personally, I think if once you have a policy in place that says either we're going to introduce students to all of the madahib, or um, we are going to introduce students to a particular madahib, and then we will make reference to others' points of distinction when needed, then you have some clarity to move forward with. But that needs to, again, needs to be addressed before it comes up, because we shouldn't let for that. You're right, it does make students very confused, and it's unwanted stress for sure. So I think coming up with that agreement is important early. Okay. Dr. Wasim, um, you always ask the deepest questions, which I don't. I'm definitely not qualified to answer. So who is closer to the nature, to fitra, the youngsters or the elders? What does general experience say about it? I don't think I have enough experience to answer the question, but I appreciate the question. Um, if anyone's experienced to answer it, I think you are. So, jazakallah khairan for the question. Okay, I'm just reading the next question from Dr. Wasim. I don't think I understand the question. The rationale or the ration of concern for teaching youngsters and the desire to learn from them is roughly fine currently. The ratio. Oh, okay, the ratio. Um, um, I think it's worthy to review. It's worthy to review the ratio, but it changes from. I think we need to be more dynamic um, in our classroom divisions. It doesn't have to be the small class size in all classes. It could be small class sizes for certain subjects or for certain topics. But because again, because of the public education system, we often we often try to fall within structures, and everything has to fall within the same structure. Which is why I think, if there's flexibility in particular schools, we should try to be a little bit more creative in having certain subjects taught in smaller groups and certain subjects taught in larger groups or certain topics and so on. The next question, our educational values are based on students' performance. How should students be evaluated in tarbiyah? That's a very good question. It's it's one of those questions, again, I'll say that connected to the public education system, it's unfortunate that we have to evaluate everything. So we have to evaluate character. But I think even though we have to do it, there are some creative ways that we can achieve it. And one of the ways is to definitely move towards a qualitative form of assessment. The development of rubrics that are qualitative rubrics are far more effective than quantitative rubrics, especially when it comes to issues of character education or tarbiyah, values, moral education. How do you evaluate tarbiyah? I think personally, the best way to do it is to ask your students that question. Tell them that you need to develop a rubric, and say we want to develop a rubric on tarbiyah, and you'd be surprised. I can almost guarantee you that you'll be surprised that students themselves will have a pretty good sense of how they would see themselves as being um, they would see themselves how they would grade themselves or evaluate themselves for having different levels of tarbiyah. That way, if you get them on board with their own sense of evaluation, you have greater buy-in from them. And I think that's extremely important. Imposing a set of performance standards for tarbiyah on students makes the experience very disconnected from from them. But you want to involve them in the process and make them feel like they're part of it. Okay, I think I've captured all the questions. That's a good question. How can teachers and educator scholars as a whole ummah contribute? I think what we need what we need is a global community of educators. And one of the things that we're trying to do with the Islamic teacher education program is developing a network of educators that have begun to share a common interest and a common foundation. So one of the things that we've done with the alumni who have taken the Islamic teacher education program is we've tried to create a community, and it hasn't been all too successful yet, but we're hoping that we're able to revive a forum for discussion and the development, like you mentioned, of research and development um, of educators that have, once they've gone through this program, we will all be speaking a similar language, and we'll all have a similar foundation of educators who are all over the globe, and will be online. And then we can start thinking about, curriculum development projects or, research projects or whatever it might be. But hopefully we'll create a network. And we're getting there. Alhamdulillah, I think it's growing. The other thing that I think is important is to have research-based institutions. There are a few that are being considered at universities, but the problem with university-based research is it becomes very theoretical, and it's not what we currently need. Well, we do need, but we need a balance. So finding that balance is where we are, and I think that one of the aspirations of our program, inshallah, with your help and everyone's involvement, is to achieve this sense of global community online. Sister Ragiba, if you don't mind, if I may ask to take leave, I think I need to rest my voice. But Jazakallah khairan to all of you for attending and for your very, very valuable questions. It was a pleasure to engage and discuss with you, and inshallah, hopefully, we'll stay in touch. And um, Jazakallah khairan to Sister Rahiba for coordinating. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.